systems as we have now. Oh, sorry, the recording just started. So we had about 145 employees, and now we're just getting over the 500 mark. Because of how a small company is structured, each division had its own person making their decisions about what systems they're going to use to best suit their processes. And then all of a sudden we get into this size, which, there's people here with 8,000 employees, and I'm sure it happens, especially there, is all of a sudden the systems aren't talking to each other and people are asking questions, and there's a couple experts in the room who can rule over everyone because they kind of have their fingers in every system. And so you become overly dependent on maybe one or two employees. So there came a need where we're like, no, we need to be able to have all executives have the power to cross, pollinate that data to tell an accurate story. And so that's where we're at now, where we're now working with Tableau. So we're all going to start using Tableau to tell that story of the data analytics, and we're right at the cusp. So we had a lot of pain points in getting there. It took us about 2 to 3 years to get all the systems under control, figure out which ones are out there not being used, which ones are being underutilized. And it's been really educative. But our main goal is that department heads and executives have all the true data when they want it at their fingertips. You're on mute right now.
Thank you. So was that part of a bigger digital transformation organizationally? Okay.
One of our goals, I have, as organizational development, it's a lot about how quickly can we get our users to adopt, whether it's apps that they're using, new systems. We partner with, we're property management, so that's very data heavy. So we're always partnering with companies like Yardi or RightSource in order to track our resident data and the life of a resident. So what was happening is I have this personal goal. I think everything should be as easy as YouTube and Google, because everyone knows how to use those. And so Excel sheets, before, some people, when they're coming in entry level or from a different organization, you actually first have to teach them how to read an Excel sheet before you can even start getting them to do the work. And these are very complex sheets that go all the way to like triple P on some of these tabs once you start pulling all the data out. It's just not realistic. And so for us, it was just about studying the market, make it user friendly so we can get people to the work quicker.
Okay, great. All right. How about Andy? So same idea, just your journey, how did it start?
Yeah, and I had the opportunity to not only work within my own organization, but work with several other companies, being part of consulting companies for so long. And so I got to see a lot of the beginning of the journey. And, us personally, we started with really thinking about the end in mind. So I was doing a lot of business process optimization. And at that time, that process or methodology was largely based on interviews and documentation review. And you really didn't get to really the core of what was happening in processes. And you could give recommendations based on that. But if you could actually get to the data, then that told a story. So at that time, and this was, I'm going to age myself, back in 99 and 2000 timeframe, we started collecting data that was on tapes and started transferring it to our server room, which was less powerful than our phones are today. But really starting to understand where the process breakdowns, what are the things that really need to be addressed from a business perspective, and how can we use data to get there? So 2 things that came out of that. One is it really identified root causes and allowed us to really laser focus in on what would provide the biggest business impact, both long-term from process improvement, but also value recovery. So how could we get, things that were sitting on the table, dollars that could be recovered? So obviously that had a lot of sway in starting to use data more effectively. Big data came around, and the pitfall that happened was everybody got excited and started hiring. It was really viewed as more of a technical and technology solution than a business solution. So everybody started hiring, the data scientists, the mathematicians, statisticians, bringing in the big data technology, but really hadn't touched on the small data and hadn't thought about what the end game was. So this was true then when I ultimately left EY, joined a learning and development company and focused on that industry as well, where there was a lot of data that existed. A lot wasn't being collected to that question or that pool that several people answered, is collecting the right data. But the biggest pitfall I saw was that people weren't thinking about strategy specific to business. What are the user stories? What are the use cases we're really trying to use this for? Then back into, okay, what's the data we need? What's the technology we need? And what are the people we need to really enable that? So it really starts again with thinking about the end in mind, and calling out those use cases, those user stories, and how are you going to use those? So making sure that it's, when you actually get that, what's the action you're going to take once you start doing that analysis? Then you can start getting into the technical side.
Yeah, look, your story about using the tapes, it sort of triggered the question in my mind of, just because you can get the data, is it always worth getting the data? Right.
Right.
Yeah. And
and that can be overwhelming. I mean, we saw a lot of that, where you start collecting data and chasing the business problems, hammer trying to find a nail. I know that's an overused analogy, but that's what we saw a lot of, is once you start getting into that data, it's very easy to start going down rabbit holes. Yeah. So establishing that business strategy first is critical.
Yeah. So tonight we really have Michael, who has been sort of building up the process from the scratch, and bringing the organization to the digital age, figuring out what data makes sense. And Andy here, who has held many hands through the process of figuring out what data to actually look at. So with that in mind, so Andy, sort of going off of your background and, how you've seen a lot of false starts, people going down the wrong process from the very beginning, measuring the wrong things. For a company that's trying to start using data to lead the organization, mm-hmm. What would you say is probably one of the best places to start?
Yeah. So building off that last question, certainly thinking about the end in mind, but more specifically, taking the baby steps, right? Like, so really getting down to what are the things that are going to be most impactful to your organization. So when I started the advanced learning intelligence function at Regis, we spent a lot of time on understanding organizations and specifically what was going to have big business impact, and how do we get there in those baby steps. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of small data that can be worked with. And even with really basic tools. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So starting to build towards what's that big vision. So a lot of organizations I work with today, again, everybody wants to jump to advanced analytics and machine learning. But there's so much out there right now that if you align that with the business strategy and really what you want to understand, then there's so much available out there without being overwhelmed by the technology needed or the amount of data and how you integrate all the systems. And then you can start thinking about the long-term vision. So most times when I work with an organization, I build out a multi-year roadmap and then make sure that we're building towards that, both from an ecosystem perspective as well as a business intelligence side. But there's always going to be wins happening. So that's really how I try to think about it and make sure that it's not just this big bang approach where we're trying to implement the best solution from, that would be the most impactful for the organization 3 years from now. But let's build towards that and take those little steps to start getting those quick wins and showing what the data can do from a business perspective.
Yeah. And so when you say business strategy, I think that a lot of times, it falls into the buzzword category, right? Where we say business strategy, but do you have an example of like an application, someone's just getting started off when we're saying strategy, what should we look at?
Yeah, so specifically on the people side. So one of the things that, and we can probably delve a little bit deeper into this and in some of the other questions later, but design thinking specifically around changing behaviors. So instead of just thinking about the more simple objectives of did somebody like a program, most of us want to understand was there true learning effectiveness and how do we measure that, right? And so really the ultimate goal on the people side is changing the behaviors that will have the biggest impact on the organization, as well as individual development and growth for that, for the people that are participating in that particular program. So when we talk about business strategy, there's a link between what a business objective is and how your people get there. People are, in almost all organizations, are your biggest asset. And so really aligning them with the behaviors that will drive the biggest business impact is going to be the best approach for how you design your L&D program. So the analytics are the measurement piece to that, but really the design of the programs is what's going to be driving what you ultimately measure and how you can get to that business impact. So there's a lot around how you actually align behaviors with ROI and business impact. But there's some very simple ways to do that. And just knowing that people are going to be what's driving the most important parts of your business. So the design of a program down to an individual learning program, and thinking about what you really want out of that from a people behavior change perspective, then you can design your measurement program accordingly.
Yeah, and Michael, I think you had a comment there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that because for us, I came out of property operations. So going to Andy's point, how do you get the people to do what they need to be doing? The place, if I could go back in time and start again, and we caught on maybe like a year or two later, was that job task analysis. And this was the reason why. Say, for instance, as an example, that we had a rent receivable goal, meaning we want to be collecting 97% of our rent on time every month. Sure, the executives can say that, but are they aware of the conditions that may be inhibiting that from happening? So what we did is we went and used our annual performance data, for instance, to find our top performing managers. We checked the data in another system to make sure they're actually collecting the rent. And then we did job task analysis to figure out what they were doing in order to accomplish that. And that was the data we needed to say, you know what? They're actually not even following policy, but they're more popular, they're more successful than a lot of other people because they come up with inventive ways to get the job done. So based off that job task analysis, we then used that data to build our training program. And now we had something to measure if people were following that kind of policy. And so and we use that for every single process. You have the strategic goal. We need to figure out what the top performers are doing, people who are close to it, the outliers. And then we start building from there. And then to Andy's point, we then need a system to track that particular data, not fluff, but just that data. And that's where we saved a lot of money by cutting out extraneous systems that were just giving us stuff we just were not using. It was only confusing the executives, and it was only allowing certain people to hide the story because they were coming up with dramatic reasons and anecdotes as to what's going on. But we don't care about that data. Did you follow the process or not? And that made a big change for us because we had a lot of rapid growth in the past 10 years.
Yeah. And one way I've also seen it done is, so you have strategy on one side, and so if you have like your chief whatever officer, they're always thinking in terms of things that are costing money or things that are bringing money, right? And when you're talking about strategy, it basically is going to boil down to that cost or that gain. And then we have the sort of on the other side, what I think L&D tends to be more focused on is things like being able to, collect reviews and like see sort of that micro tactical, we're able to get this measurement here. And it's about figuring out what are all the steps that, the cost here, what's the step before the cost, right? And moving it so that, and then here's like the measurement of we did a program and the program led into a leadership development thing. And so we have this holistic thing. So how do we get these two to sort of cross that line of measurements and sort of stack up? But yeah, that's very good. Yeah. And actually, and Michael too, just from the perspective of things that you've sort of been building a program, is there any barriers that you really observed in that whole process that you had to overcome?
Yeah. I could say in this day and age, people, because there's something out there to do anything, like measure anything, track anything you want, fancy, good looking stuff. But it's really, we did a lot of education and even bringing in third-party consultants to help us build that path in order to say, okay, here's everything we want to do. And we put it up on paper. We went very simple, put everything on paper that everybody wanted to achieve. And then we looked at the body count and we're like, we're not getting all of this done. So it was really until we had that visual exercise with the executives and the department heads, with them striking off, we're going to have to make this 5 years out, 6 years out, 7 years out, then everyone's gobbledygook in these big meetings. And so now we have a playbook to go by, where if someone says, hey, we want to do this, it's like, no, that's not in the plan. That's 4 years down the line. And because we're limited in size, we're nonprofit, so we only can get so much done. Now, once you've truncated your goals to the simple 2-3 goals per department, now, again, you can start making decisions and building those steps out. So the biggest barrier was people and getting them to visualize what they wanted, what was realistic. And I just want to say it again, because, drama and not data, data and not drama. We now tasked our executive leaders and our department heads that if you're coming with a problem, show us where you're getting this information. Say they and them don't exist. Don't say they said, don't they? That's not data. That's not acceptable. So if you're saying they say it, do you have a mechanism to measure that? And then we're going to measure that every year too. Don't come up with a mechanism to measure one time. We have to agree upon measures that are going to be, every quarter, every year for the next 3 to 5 years. So we established some rules of engagement. So again, there's just too much data out there to overwhelm us. We said, no, we're staying focused. Each department is going to stay focused on these goals. And then we reaped a lot of benefit from that.
All right. Any particular measurements or things that you started focusing on because of that whole process that you can?
Yeah, for example, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So we have a really good HRIS system. We use Dayforce, and then we use an LMS system that's for the property management industry. And we started doing things like looking at turnover by the type of properties layer. So since we do affordable housing, some is federally subsidized, some of it is state subsidized, some of it is multi-layer. And then we started to see stress points by looking at the HRIS system and seeing turnover. We were able to say, wow, we noticed that people at this type of property at this size, that they turn over more. And this is costing us this much money. And then from there, we were able to build new levels of management so that they had the support they need. So that's just one example of how the goal was to say, for instance, I'll go back to rents. We have a lot of other goals, but I'll just say if the goal was collecting rents and it's not getting done, then our talent development department is going in and trying to figure out why isn't it getting done? They don't know how to do it. They don't have the tools to do it. Is there a system issue? We look at all those job knowledge, information exchange, no mentoring, no job coaching. So once we knew what we were trying to achieve in the way of rent collection, then we're able to reverse and, figure out what the problem is and go forward with that. Next year, did we make improvement? Did we restructure? So then we're just tracking collecting those rents and trying to isolate the problem in the process.
I love it. So how about Andy? I know similarly, I think that Michael's done a very good job of kind of moving away from sort of the measurements that sort of lack that strategic value. Things like just, tracking how was this event, right? Yes or no, great. And then not doing anything with it. So props to being able to move away from those sorts of measurements, or doing a measurement that just is something to confirm your own bias. I think that happens a lot too, where people are trying to validate something that they want to be true. But any other key elements that maybe people should be focusing on?
Yeah. So to build off what Michael was just saying, there's two in specifically. One that I saw, L&D, like I said, I spent 15 years just focused on other domains. So once I got in the L&D side of the business, I started kind of uncovering a lot of the same things that you saw on the other functional domains, but some specific were the gap between L&D function and the business, right? So just bringing both to the table to make sure that there is alignment on what L&D is truly doing with the business. It seemed like the elephant in the room, and every client I worked with, that there was this giant gap, and part of it was, there wasn't enough, really trust in that what the L&D department would be measuring would be effective in the business impact. But largely that was driven because the business didn't align with L&D on what do we need to be designing to have the biggest business impact, right? So that was one of the first things, that those barriers that we needed to work through to make sure that what we were building was actually designing was actually aligned with what the strategy was and some of those KPIs that they really wanted to achieve. The other piece was really around kind of chasing the data, like we talked about a little bit earlier, that really may not have the biggest business impact. So a lot of times blanket programs would be designed that could have a small incremental general impact, but it comes back to the fact that there wasn't enough collaboration between the business and L&D and figuring out what really should we be focusing on. So once we got over that hurdle and really defining down to KPIs and then the specific behaviors that would drive those KPIs, then we started seeing a lot more impact.
I'm loving what Andy's saying here, because it was funny when I was talking about that exercise where we put everything on flip charts. It literally covered every wall in the room. Everyone at the top was like training. And I was cracking up because it was like, okay, I said, then, we were all doing a very active exercise. I put training on what in red after each one of the trainings. And then people are like, well, we don't have a process for that. I mean, there's nothing to train then. So that there has to be that partnership with the leadership, like Andy was saying, with understanding what L&D is. We're there to help you build a process if we have to, but we're going to also call out when there's nothing to train because there's no systems in key. And that's another barrier that you have to overcome early with your leadership if you can do that.
Yeah. And then just to one last point on this is like the ROI. So everybody talks about ROI. There's so many variables that go into return on investment or those KPIs. I mean, when you start putting out broad KPIs like increased revenue or increased profits, lower cost, right? We all know, especially in the big organizations, there's so much that goes into that. To isolate how L&D impacted that in a statistical model is nearly impossible, right? So trying to jump to, again, kind of that big data advanced analytics is not the way to go. There's so many other ways you can show how a training program had the right impact. And I often talk about the transitive rule of, if you say that these behaviors will drive this metric, and then we show that we've increased or improved these behaviors, then just know that those improvements in the KPIs that we're talking about were related to that, right? And you'll start seeing it at a macro level. But the pitfall of trying to say this particular program had a 2% impact on increased profitability is near impossible. And nothing against the ROI Institute, but to say we can isolate business variables and say this program had that direct impact is really hard from a statistical model perspective. So there's other ways to do that. And that's what's going to start creating that bridge from L&D to the business.
Yeah, I think I might use that as a bit of a pivot. So I know that we're working with companies of all sizes here. Budget to be able to actually have tools to be able to, like LMS versus the data tools like Power BI, Visio, Tableau, Domo, very expensive tools. And with all those things you just mentioned, where, complex statistical models and things that I think most people, it's not actionable at this point, right? So just from the perspective of where should they be spending their time and money, are there any suggestions? I don't know if either of you want to take that first.
Yeah, I'm going to be controversial right now, so no one quote me on this, even though it's recording and you could quote me on this. I'm done with LMSs. Now I have to use an LMS, but learning management systems are purely, in my opinion, they're not managing learning, they're managing compliance. They're telling you whether you're in compliance or not. Going back to what I said before, 80% of our learning in our company is now YouTube, Google, meaning that we created the knowledge base, the knowledge bank, but we first found out what everyone was doing. And then we put all the helpful resources, we made them subject matter experts, we made them coaches, we made them job shadowers. We said, what form do you use? We put in the knowledge bank. We referenced the YouTube video. Like, if I could go back and do it again, then I would have been like, I could have used a much smaller compliance tool to track this. And there's many of us, if we're using HRIS systems, they already have it in there. It's thrown in as a package, you know, or there's some other system that somehow tracks compliance. And so that, I know that's kind of controversial, but I do see that going forward, it's really treating people with the respect and dignity that they give themselves when they want to learn the piano, or if they want to learn to cook a dish, or if they want to put together their own garden plot. People are, when they're motivated to do a good job, they're going to go get the information. You just have to make it super one click away for them. So that's how we've designed our, I'm calling it the knowledge bank now. We have the compliance system, but our knowledge bank is one click away. And that's changed performance in our organization.
Are you able to share a little bit more about what that knowledge bank is? Is it?
Sure. So we use gamification a lot. So there's what they have to know, like, you know, safety, security, health, certain laws that they have to know, fair housing, sexual harassment. But they go in and they play games for like 2 to 3 minutes a day. I know it sounds weird, but they actually video game 2 to 3 minutes a day and compete with each other. But on the back end of that system, we dump all of our knowledge in a system that's searchable like Google. We keyword tag it. We have a resource that they can look to see everything that applies to their job, including every single task for their job. And then when they look at, oh yeah, I need to learn how to do that, they can click the hyperlink and go to the job aid for it, maybe video, maybe even experts you can contact and reach out in the organization for job shadowing. And so that's what it looks like. And it's available on the phone as an app, because that's where we try to go where people are, not force them to go somewhere. And so we got it onto their work phones or their PCs. So it's the first thing that pops up in the morning. They get to 2 to 3 minutes of what they have to do. But then they also know that this is my system to ask questions. And then they can always call my 4-person department also, and we point them in the right direction if we need to.
And how long did it take to get them onto? So like you have mobile, you have like all these Googles, you have YouTubes and everything. Mm-hmm. What
Sure.
is like in its first iteration?
Yeah, 2 years. I say for an organization our size, nothing happens in under 2 years, because we do things in 2 phases. First is adoption, meaning, okay, you just know how to use it. You don't even have to use it correctly. So we just get them pushing buttons and getting in there. And then once we have 100% adoption on, say, a new app or a new process, then what we start doing is sharing out, now, how are your teams doing? Because again, it's gamified. So how are your teams doing on this process? Oh, Joe's team is kicking butt over Andy's team, right? And keep a very fun environment. And then we start tracking the numbers if they're starting to hit the goals. So adoption to actual moving numbers, I say 2 years. That's why I promise people.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how about Andy? So when you've worked with some smaller organizations, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, so specific to tools, there's a few different things we want to think about, starting with the collection, right? So there's a lot of source systems that you can get data from, and obviously there's a lot of underlying ecosystem and architecture things that need to be in place to actually be able to collect that data. So the data warehouse and making sure that all the source systems are integrated. And then there's a lot just on the data integrity side and governance side to make that happen. So small organizations, what I found, are usually a bit behind on that front. So that's one of the first steps is making sure that as you're running different BI reporting tools, regardless of what the presentation layer is, Tableau, Power BI, even Excel, that we're thinking about underlying first. Because what you don't want to do is start doing reporting on things with bad integrity or where there's multiple sources of truth. So just starting to think about working with your IT department or your data department, if that exists, on making sure that ecosystem is there. I have multiple projects going right now where they brought us in to do business intelligence, and we're having to kind of slow down and tell them, in a separate work stream, we need to make sure this data is right because we're seeing all kinds of challenges there. So that's just, not technology specific, but just a layer that needs to be considered. From a specific tool perspective, when I talk about like collection of data, there's those source systems, but there's also a lot of instruments that you can use, survey tools, thinking about, again, what are the metrics that we need and what's the data requirement that we actually need to collect. There's a lot of great data that's out there that you can collect without having this fully integrated ecosystem with a data warehouse. So it could be, kind of spot sets of data that you might think about for the specific business objective you have. And you can do that in a way that's very simple, very cost effective, and still has the integrity that you need. So that's one thing to think about. On the presentation layer, which is usually when we start thinking about technology like Tableau and Power BI, Excel has come a long way. I've taught so many programs for what I call the generalist on how can you be an effective data analyst without needing to rely on your specialist. So one of the other things I see in most organizations, especially small ones, is that there might be a BI department or a data department, but they are so backlogged that the time frame to actually get something out, in the form that you want it, there's a lot of iterations and it takes a lot of time. So there's a lot of small data things that you can do in Excel. In fact, I designed a lot of programs on how you can do end-to-end of collecting data, cleansing that data, creating the charts and the visualizations, and then still getting that impact of what's really the most important piece of interpretation of what those results mean, and then presentation to your stakeholders. Not to just kind of cue you up, Jeff, because I know there's a video that you might have that you'll be sharing, but Excel has come a long way. I'll say 10 years ago, I would say, don't ever use Excel for data analytics, but Microsoft has done a really nice job in allowing really creating that accessibility to everybody, where you don't have to be so reliant on a data scientist or a data specialist.
Yeah, and I pulled this up quickly. It's actually in our prep because I do a lot of work in Domo. I think Michael, you're moving over to Tableau, was it, or was it? Yeah. So we have companies like Power BI, and I think that when we hear terms like business intelligence, right, and being able to pull together all of these different data into a story, right? So the whole story concept. Everybody here, I'm going to send out this deck, but I found, this whole quick, 1 hour video on just building out dashboards, just to give you that sort of framework to use to be able to, especially with Microsoft Excel and the new Office 360 versions where everything's cloud-based, right? And being able to link up Excel sheets so you have different departments. So I think, Michael, going back to, you're working with departments and they're telling you they need to bring the data and it gets them into that habit of actually tracking something and being able to have them work on their sheets, and then having all these things sort of file up or come together into a single Excel sheet.
Yeah, I just want to say, because that's what the pain point we're at right now is there were those experts, or maybe, my department was looking into a lot of different systems, but the time it took to get a report together, it was just impossible because we had to go to so many systems. So for us, Tableau is what was the decision made by our BT team to finally bring it together. So now we're just asking everybody, what story do you want to tell, at this point? Otherwise, I just couldn't imagine going another 2 to 3 years with our rate of growth, trying to get anything that's useful in the way of data, unless we could put a one-stop shop together for people.
Yeah, I think, Andy, you also hit on the challenge of working with these tools are great, but oftentimes you need a special data scientist. So somebody who knows how to bring in the data sources, then they know how to manipulate it so it's in a format that an average person can look at and actually be able to interpret. Whereas being able to go through something like Excel, a person who can manage to make a pivot table can effectively make a dashboard. That may be a challenge for some groups, but oftentimes you have somebody, like, it's becoming table stakes these days for a lot of different roles. And that's going back to the beginning when Michael and I were talking about the digital transformation of an organization. So making sure that you're building out those core skills of, how do you have people who have that basic skill around, creating an Excel sheet, making things from their perspective, and then just getting help to change the data to a way that basically getting someone's help to just get them to be able to make the data themselves, right? So that then, I love how you've done it in your organization, Michael, we've showed you how to, you need to come to the table with the actual documented challenge, and then we see it on the dashboard, and now we can act on it. So, yeah. All right, let me stop sharing.
And it's much more cost effective.
Yeah. So a lot of times
it's expensive when you start getting into these tools. Yeah, there's no question. I think most organizations, I would absolutely recommend that there's at least pockets of these for sure, and there's ways you can distribute them and deploy them that is much more cost effective. But yeah, Excel is so accessible, and it has a lot of the same capabilities. So I definitely wouldn't shy away from figuring out ways you can use that. The key though is just like before we, in any of my programs, I talk about visualization. There's this buildup again of what we talked about on the onset of the discussion today of, first of all, thinking about your business objectives, how you translate that into use cases, prioritization of those, thinking about truly what you want to measure, what are those metrics. And then there's the data cleansing, the data management piece before you get to the visualization. So I always want to make sure we're teaching that before we get to the fun stuff of how do you build a visualization and generate the insights out of that. So
yeah, I mean, the warning is too, because we'll all experience is that, and we should, meaning that, okay, we found out what we wanted to measure. And then someone at the other end say, and while we're out, we should also measure. And we should also measure. It's like, you have to really control that. It's like, you know what? Yeah. Let's prove that we can produce one good table first. Then we'll add on to that. So again, sometimes we're corralling we're herding cats on that, but it's really those leadership behaviors that have to, you have to start with it.
So with like an organization like yourself, Michael, hey, you have all the different, the gamification elements, you have the YouTubes, you have all those things. I'm assuming you have some sort of dashboard metrics and you've been able to make,
yes.
Okay. So
yeah. So again, where we're at right now is we have our, financial data, which is coming out looking one way. We have a lot of advocacy data and PR data, which is looking another way. We have development spreadsheets, huge development. You can imagine pre-construction, construction of buildings. Then we have all this, what we call resident services data, meaning who are the families that live at our sites and what support services do they need. Then we have all the property man. So we have HRS, and then we have LMS. So what's happening is that everyone's asking these questions because we're trying to grow our business by 10,000 more units in the next 10 years, so 1,000 units a year. But everybody's a little expert on everything, and so we're done with that. We said we have to bring everything together. We have a very well written out strategic plan, and so now we're looking at each bullet point and say, okay, what are our markers for this? Even our DEI survey data is pulled into it and integrated. So that's where we kind of put the brakes on it. And next week we actually have our 4-day Tableau class, and we took all our questions and we're bringing them into the class so that we can do build outs and have some success coming out of the class with some basic spreadsheets, to look at.
Yeah. How about Andy, for yourself? How do you advise people to use the data a bit better, so to be able to manage that whole process that Michael's in right now? So in the phase that we're moving people to, actually 2 steps. So we're we want to get to the point where we can move to a tool like Tableau, and then once they're going on to Tableau. So
yeah, again, it's really that underlying layer of really making sure you have the right ecosystem, the governance to manage and maintain that data. It's so often that I come in and see multiple sources of truth. We'll call them rogue analytics or BI departments that are pulling their own data from who knows what sources. And then even when there is a data warehouse, there is, a lot of times I'll go into it and there's not the right naming conventions, there's not the right operating procedures. So you just see this data layer just continue to grow and move apart. It's one thing to grow, data volume. It's another thing when you start seeing Z codes and different naming conventions and all of a sudden multiple IDs and, where it's near impossible to link anything. And then you start running into some of the data integrity issues from source systems, or in the translation of the data warehouse, where you're having, clients that are 1,000 years old. This is very real. I see that in almost every customer data source that I look at. In some cases there's some anomalies, but when you start seeing that, that's so pervasive. So So, again, before we start thinking about the visualization layer, regardless of what tool you use, it's critically important to make sure that the data integrity exists. It's coming from a single source of truth, and that there's the governance around it to maintain and manage it, because it can quickly, especially with fast growing organizations, get really out of control. And then the cost and effort to actually bring that back is pretty significant.
Yeah. Well, so I think what I'm hearing is, so first steps from any organization is talk to the other departments, figure out what's already being tracked, figure out what tools they're using to track it, right? Trying to figure out what sort of consistency you can build into a process, so that you're putting things in the same place with the same names, and then ultimately figuring out, we have all these data elements, what are we measuring, right? What are the incremental steps to get to the measurement that we want to actually pull out of it? So does that sound fair? So,
yep.
All right. So what I want to do with, so we have about half an hour left, and we're not going to watch the video, but I'm actually going to break us into some groups, and we're going to try to split fairly evenly amongst our groups. Let me put this into our chat. And what I'll be doing is effectively having equal sized groups where Michael, Andy, and myself will be with the groups, and just want to hear, the chance for everyone to first connect, share something about yourself, where you are in the data process, and then maybe a first step that you want to implement. And we'll try to do this over the next 10 minutes or so. And then we'll come back and we'll have an opportunity to share, and we'll just do some closing conversations with Michael, Andy, and the group. All right. So with that, I just need to figure out how to do breakout rooms. Okay. All right. So we're gonna do 3 breakout rooms, and just need to move one person, and we should be good. Actually, I think we should be good. All right, so I'm going to open it up. So I put the conversation in the chat, but yeah, looking forward to having you guys connect and then coming back together and hearing how things are going.
Oh, Kelly, I can't
No,
hear you
and
for
Jeff
some
is
reason. Yeah, Jeff, did you put us in the
You
room
put us
together
in the room
deliberately?
together. You're
Oh,
on
I can't
mute.
hear Jeff either.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Kelly?
weird. I can't hear Kelly or Jeff. Is it us?
Oh,
Oh, there we
Yes,
go.
I can hear you now.
Kelly, I think I had to reset my audio settings for some reason.
Kelly, you might want to do the same thing.
Yeah, by the mute button, there should be a little
It's
option.
over by the mute button. Use the.
Oh, interesting. Hmm.
Did it work?
No, not yet.
Okay. Well, the good news is you're not muted. So the bad news is you're not muted. So, but it sounds like you
But
can
can
hear
you
us.
hear us, Kelly?
Okay.
Oh, okay, you can hear us.
Okay, so if worse
It's gonna be
comes to worse, we could use the chat instead.
Yeah.
Although it would be delightful to,
Yeah.
to actually hear you, Kelly. So hopefully it gets figured out. Jeff, this is blowing my mind, this session. When I think, was it Andy who said about ROI and things and stuff, and I'm like, thank goodness someone has finally said it.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how you do ROI.
Exactly.
Well,
yeah.
and he's right that the ROI Institute, it's it was like one of those sort of, they got a lot of attention, but there's certain people who put a lot of credence into it, but realistically it's still not tenable to be able to truly pull out. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
because it is true. There are so many other variables that go into things. Like, how good is your manager? How good are the systems set up? Are the processes rolled out properly? What?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think a lot of it does get dumped on L&D. It's like, oh, but we need to train them, and when we train them, it'll work. It's like,
Training's always the solution.
So how about, let's do quick introductions, because I don't know if Kelly, and we won't be able to hear as much from you, but maybe Kelly and, Joanna and Rafi, I know you both work together. Do you want to do a quick introduction for Kelly?
sure. I'll go first. I'm Joanna. I'm Senior Talent Development Specialist at Fremont Bank, a small community bank in the Bay Area. I'm also VP of Membership. So welcome, Kelly, at ATD Golden Gate. I mean, not at Fremont Bank. Welcome, Kelly. I'm going to be sending you a welcome email later. So if you have any questions, feel free to connect. Yeah.
And I'm Rafi Sison. I am the Director of Talent Development at Fremont Bank. And I am here as a guest of Joe's.
All right, well, thank you for coming. And so I think I already had a bit of my introduction, but Jeff Baumann, ATD president, and looking forward to being immediate past president with Kalinga, who's going to be taking over. But I've been working in a lot of the LXP space, so learning experience platforms, talent development platforms. And that's where I think when Michael was talking about like the LMSs and very compliance focused, and you're kind of measuring the wrong things, like you're basically just measuring to make sure that we haven't stepped outside of compliance. So that's a lot of what I end up addressing every day, because an LXP tends to sit on top of a lot of the experience layer of users, and you start to get more metrics and actually pull in more metrics from different systems. So that's how I fell into data, basically because for years and years and years with LMSs, you have this reporting mindset where we're just finding this thing that's been tracked versus, and you're often measuring the wrong things. Like, did people spend like the button seat rules, right? Did they actually sit down and finish this thing all the way through, or do we have to force them? They can't go off their screen. All of these mind-blowing things that you're just thinking, there's a type 1 and a type 2 error. Either you're measuring the wrong thing or the wrong thing. It's I forget the other one, but basically measurement issues around of what you're doing. And I feel like L&D for a long time has just been so limited by what it can measure that it just sort of resigned itself to reporting. So that's what it drives me. So yeah. But no, Kelly, I see in the background you have Ciudad de Todos, Chihuahua. Is that I wish I could read lips. In Mexico? Okay. So do you live in Mexico? Okay. Okay. So
Fun vacation, maybe.
Yeah. I love the mural. I do love the mural. That's beautiful. So so how about so I got Fremont Bank here. Where is Fremont Bank in the measurement process? Did I get it right? Fremont, right?
Yeah, it was really interesting listening to the discussion, actually. I'd say we're at the very start. Rafi, thumbs up, thumbs down, agree with me. And what's interesting is that we are looking at our community banking group training. So the branches and the contact center, and we're coming into a phase of kind of redesigning that. And there are actually a lot of ideas that I've written down that we could get some really good data from that side of the business around, products sold, so the sales aspect of it, processes followed, or where there are errors kind of happening.
Yeah.
That I think that could be I was kind of getting excited about the amount of data that we could actually get from there. And because we're fully redesigning the learning, it's actually a great opportunity to go into it with that data in mind. What are we measuring? How are we measuring it? So yeah, I would say it's basically happy sheets is where we're at.
Yeah. Oh, I think we can hear you now, Kelly.
Can you?
Yes.
Yay! I took my earpods out and put them back in. It was like, let me see what's going on.
No, it's the turn it off, turn it on thing. Of course.
It's like I don't want to leave, but let me just try this.
It's funny because your picture even moved on my screen. It like shifted down all
Yeah,
of a
I saw your
It's like,
picture.
woo! Well, yes, my background is the Watanejo, and it was part of a 3-week vacation in January of 2020.
Oh,
Yes.
Wonderful. Good
Yes.
timing.
yeah.
Perfect timing, and then came back to, I work for the Peninsula Jewish Community Center. I'm the HR director there, and I'm at the beginning of collecting data and trying to get people on the same page about what data is important to collect and what to measure, and reaffirming our goals. Are they the same now as pre-COVID? So just at the beginnings, and it was nice to hear that you don't need a lot of fancy tools in order to be successful, that you can just start with Excel, or we have Salesforce and there's a possibility of utilizing that. But I want to make sure we're measuring the right things.
Yeah.
Since there's so many people that, want data, but how do we get it consistently? And I think it's organizational data that we're looking at, about our culture, first and foremost. That's what we want to survey and understand how we can do better.
That's the good thing. So if you're using Salesforce, I think if you remember back to strategy tends to boil down to dollars, like either lost or gained, right? And that is fortunately one thing Salesforce is very good at from perspective. But I think it's the challenge there of kind of working backwards from, we had the result, what got us to that result, right? So,
right.
Yeah. So, but it also has good visualization tools in Salesforce if you have someone who wants to sit down and dig through it. So, yeah. So I'm going to quickly bounce over to the other rooms and to see how they're doing, and then probably bring everybody back really quick. But feel free to converse amongst each other real quick, and I will be back in a moment.
And one of the things was, you good, Jeff? You're on mute. I can't hear you. Oh, wait. I can't hear you.
There you go.
Muted. There.
Might change rooms. It resets everything.
Okay.
So, just wanted to see if you guys were good and ready to come together.
Oh, yeah. I was going to answer one. Can you give me 1 minute to answer a question?
Okay. We'll go for till 6:45 and I'll bring us back. Okay. Let me go
perfect.
talk to Andy's. All right. Thanks, guys.
Okay. So just as
the experience design, but then having like the visualization, right? So being able to build the visuals, and it's hard to gauge, can you interpret those? Or do they have the skill to interpret? But usually if they have the strong business acumen, then usually they have the interpretation where they can generate the insights and they can communicate those. But I look for Power BI and Tableau. I mean, those are, and if they have those, then generally with that broader business acumen, I generally try to look for MBAs that have the analytic skills second. You know what I mean? Like, so, which was my background. So I was MIS, I got my MBA in MIS. So I was more business focused, and then I learned the technical skills. So
great, thank you.
I'm going to bring us back together at 6:45, so 2 more minutes, but it sounds like you're having a good conversation. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more. All right.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.
Putting together reports for everybody, but he's never been able to incorporate the HR data because we stand alone, and the HR platform is so totally different and separate, so that's one of the pieces. And I think like Joe's approach, where we're able to gather the data that's coming out of the branches, that will help us out, without putting in our HR data into the system.
Yeah.
Right.
I was going to say that it's Fremont Bank, I think, because you have how many employees? Like 800, 1,000?
It's about 850 now.
Yeah.
800, yeah.
I think you're getting into the range where you kind of need to start looking at like a stronger tool. I think Excel is like a good place to start, but from a visual standpoint, but
Yeah.
We use
Yeah,
Tableau.
we actually
do?
have
And
Tableau.
okay.
yeah, we have
Yeah.
Tableau, and that was what I was just telling Kelly when you were coming in, Jeff, where we have a whole group that does the warehousing,
Mhm.
and they collected all the data. They have data for the whole organization,
Mhm.
minus HR, because HR has
Oh.
never allowed access to our data.
Oh no.
Yeah. Hey, Rafi, your connection's not so great. You're kind of breaking in and out a little bit.
Well,
Yeah,
Images.
I'm gonna bring us back
Yeah.
into the all rooms real quick, but
Okay.
hopefully you guys can share there and maybe get
Right.
the feedback from like Andy too about his take on it. But
Yeah.
they should be able to share with you, and they should be able to share with view only rights. That's the shame that yeah.
Because there's so much good data that like it, if we could just pull it together, it would have such a good
Yeah.
picture. But yeah, people have their little fiefdoms.
Yeah.
So.
And I think I heard this in the other room too of I think Andy was talking about his sort of hiring process and how he does the data, and he tends to find people who have more of an MBA mindset versus a data mindset. So an MBA who thinks more of like organizational cost structures and things like that,
Yeah.
and then knows how to apply the data to it,
Mhm.
versus a data person who's just like, we have data, does a little happy dance, and then doesn't do anything helpful, right? So yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Well, it's nice
Thanks,
meeting
Kelly.
you all.
Nice to meet you, Kelly. Bye.
Room.
I
So
did
there's
not-
only 4 people. There we go. Only 4 people were still enrolled.
Well, now we're 5.
Yeah. Yep.
And maybe we're 6, 7, we're getting there, but I don't know. Jeff, Lori Dawson and I were in a group by ourselves. I don't know how that happened.
Oh, she was still there. I saw that she had
In
dropped.
one group and I was supposed to be in another, but when I clicked join, I ended up not joining, but I was in a space with Lori. So we had a good talk.
Okay.
Not yet. She wasn't a member, but she might become one now.
Okay.
Good job, Jess.
Yeah. So we had a really good discussion, and
That is
but-
so strange because I like made 3 rooms. So you somehow made
well, I
magic
know
room.
when I saw join group 3, I went to click it and it disappeared.
Oh no.
So what
Oh,
I
well.
clicked was an empty screen. I did not, Paul, click leave, but I clicked an empty screen. So maybe she and I were just out in the middle of cyberspace together.
Okay. I think you're in the 4th room. So
But I don't know if Lori is still here, but if she is,
it's
maybe she's not. She did write a chat saying she had to leave, but then she and I found each other, so she didn't then, but she must have now.
Okay.
Okay, I'll shut up now and get myself back on.
Well, I wanted to, so hopefully when I jumped across all the different rooms, I think I heard a couple of common themes around, I think also, when do you move to a tool like Power BI, Tableau? I'm not sure. I think Andy, I think I heard you talking about when you were sort of looking for people to start doing some of the data roles. I heard something about MBAs versus pure data people, right? So yeah. And did you want to elaborate a little bit more on that for the group?
Yeah. So it was, in building practices, one of the things, I learned kind of the hard way, and I think a lot of organizations is that, again, there was this kind of rush to get data scientists, mathematicians, statisticians, and jump right into big data architects, data engineers. And then I found this role to be probably the most impactful, is the conduit to everyone, the business, the scientists, the engineers, the architects, was what I call BI specialists, and that have strong business acumen, but have the, I'll say, secondary skill set. I mean, a lot of times they're, it's parallel in how good they are in kind of consulting in business acumen, but also within their particular domain, their particular industry, but they have some really strong technical skills. And so for that role, it's the most critical in my practices, and that I've built, and I bring in a lot of MBAs that seem to have that, clearly the business skills, but also they have a specialization in data or analytics. And one of the things that specifically I look for is, if I can get an MBA that can has the experience and the background in the visualization side, as well as communication, right? So the actual generation of the insights and the communication to stakeholders. And then they can usually talk the talk. What I was saying is they're not going to go build a logistic regression model, but they understand it and they know what model should be used or what visualization should be used to achieve whatever that business objective is. So,
yeah. So for organizations who, maybe they're trying to build like even one step below an MBA, do you have any recommendations for that?
Yeah, it's a similar skill set. I mean, they don't necessarily have to have a master's, but if they have whatever in the case of L&D, if they have an experienced design, instructional design background, and then have some skills, whether they did that through the university or some offline program, which are what I was commenting on is it's so accessible now to take those different programs that you find a lot. I found a lot in my organization when I joined Propeller that were internal that had again a certain specialization, but then had certification in various DNA skills. So that's, again, doesn't have to be an MBA, but again, instructional designer, experienced designer with something, again, experience or education, even informal education within SQL, Power BI, Tableau, some of the more advanced Excel skill sets is usually one that would kind of pass the screen in my recruiting process, and then you can dig a little deeper from there.
Yeah, I think when I first started poking around SQL, I found out that it's basically like VLOOKUP times 10, where it's basically just putting all these tables together and letting the system do it. And then, so I think it's helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, once you get the basics of Excel, Microsoft Access into SQL, it's just then, I mean, really the basic code behind it, if then, else, and that usually gets you most of the way there for anything you try to do. So
I'd say the other trick that I've seen is as talent and L&D organizations are trying to build these connections. So when you're doing your audits of organizations, you're trying to figure out what tools are happening. Hopefully you're also building relationships with subject matter experts in the field and then poaching them. Because if you audit, a lot of times the subject matter experts are doing things that they like, but sometimes you stumble onto that person who really enjoys the kind of training side of things. And then if you can get that sort of real job skill set, bring it into the talent organization, find people in like internal marketing, comms, that's a great tool. That's outside measurements, but getting those people in there, getting the data side of things, you have the engineers, because sometimes you stumble onto those gems, or you at least build a relationship with somebody who can help you do that thing. I think in our group, we're talking about how I think Joe and Rafi, how your organization had the tools but didn't want to share it, right? So I think that's one of those stumbling blocks that can happen. It's all about relationships and being able to figure out, doing that audit, figuring out what's there. How about Michael? I wanted to get a chance to hear from your group. I didn't get to hear as much as I did about Andy's though, so I'd love to get
no problem. We were talking more about behavior. It was the challenges that Paul was pointing out is, I think he said they have 1,100 employees with a lot of job descriptions. It makes he sounded like there was 1,100 employees with 1,100 job descriptions. So how do you standardize any kind of training? So that's a huge, realistic challenge for a lot of smaller organizations. And then Jen, who has a lot of experience with HR, was asking about behavior change and what that 2-year process looks like. And it came down to psychology. Like I was letting them kind of know, I was getting into the heads, trying to figure out who would resist the change, who would jump into the change, and just going for adoption first, meaning putting them in a fun environment. We actually did like an escape room to prove that the example we used, maintenance people could use a phone for doing work orders or inspections. So we made it fun, and they're like playing this game, they're competitive. We proved as their names came up on the leaderboard, you can use the technology. All right, now that we know you can use it, now let's make it policy to use it. So they couldn't, so we didn't just throw a new system at them, but we used the data. They were there looking at the data that, yes, I showed up. Yes, I can do it. I was even giving one-on-one training. Now, am I putting in work orders electronically? So we focus more on that, just creating the foundation, like Andy had said before, create the foundation of what you're looking for, and build from there. And for me, it's a 2-year process. I always tell people for anything complex or teaching people new systems.
Yeah, so that's the other big takeaway from today. Always promise 2 years. So
it's this. I'm a Star Trek fan, so Scotty, you know, even though he can repair the warp engine in 1 hour, he always says it takes half a day, and that's how he's a miracle worker. So I use that same premise.
Yeah.
Under promise, overachieve. All right. Well, looks like we have about 5 minutes left, and I did want to end on, I think, an important topic whenever you talk about data. And this is for Michael and Andy, but I think as you start getting into more and more data, and you start sort of meandering into areas that can become a little bit gray about, you know, boundaries and things like that. So I did want to go to Andy and Michael and just get some insights about how you can get data without crossing those boundaries. Actually, maybe Michael, I don't know if you'd like to share first.
Yeah, I'll start first. I have to compliment Andy too, because he'll be at a level of data I'll never be at. I just didn't go that way. I'm more trying to figure out the story and working with the business analysts that you talked about. I was fortunate that our organization hired one person per system, which was really great. But when it comes to the ethics of that now too, most of us might be familiar with the term data mining, where people are trying to prove their point with data. So for us, we had ethics discussions. I'll give one example. With our annual employee engagement data, I had a meeting because we get all the way down to ethnicity, we get down to age, we get it down to gender with it. So what I did is meet with the executives, and I said, we're going to set some rules that apply for the next 5 to 10 years about how we look at this data. And we sat down, we created the rules about what we're looking at and what limits even the executive, how far they're allowed to drill down into it. And that took about a 2 to 3 week process. We established the rules of engagement. So we're always asking the same question. We're not changing it to meet our needs. So that's just one example is, what are you going to use the data for? What are the rules of engagement? Is it a single source of truth? And what's the purity of the data? Those are established earlier to help keep up the ethics. And L&D departments, we oftentimes are they think it's bad news, but I say, we're just the bearers of news. Take it how you want. But that means we have to make sure our data is pure and it stands up against critics. Love it.
Yeah, I think that don't keep finding the new thing to measure. I think what did you call it before when the and thens, is that what it was?
And how about, and let's do this, the ands.
Yeah, the ands. Yeah, same idea, but yeah. So I think that consistency, that's paramount. So yeah. And Andy?
Yeah, what I found is there's always a lot of hesitation, especially when we start talking about PII. But the reality is that we're not trying to get to individual data. What we're trying to see is patterns and trends, and give us enough data where we can even do machine learning about analyzing kind of what are some of the drivers of certain things. One of the first things we do is just remove all PII, and that's even in training programs, I said that is unnecessary. Like, use IDs, get the demographic information, and then build your models toward whatever business objective you're trying to achieve. So there's a lot of easy ways to.
Pause real quick. So PII would be personally identifiable information, in case anybody was wondering. Okay, sorry.
Sorry. And so there's no need for any of my teams to have any of that, nor when we start generating the insights, even on the drill downs. Again, it's more about certain drivers and less about the individuals. So that's one just kind of rule of thumb, right? Let's just establish that up front, show how we're going to protect that data, move away from that. And it also, will remove some of the biases when we get to the interpretation piece too. And then there's also a piece of really thinking about, again, where are we going with the model, and again, less about the individual and even the variables that we're trying to pull, is starting with what the business objective is and what are the variables that we need to do that, and what's the rest of the fact pattern. So meaning, the data can tell us a lot, but there inherently is going to be things that jump out, right? And unless you dig deeper into that, and I've seen this a lot, where that action starts immediately on a dashboard, and that should never happen. The way I tell my teams is that that's an observation and a preliminary observation at that. So let's dig deeper, and sometimes that's working with the business experts to really understand what else is going on, right? So if we see attrition and there's a spike during a certain period, there's probably a lot of underlying qualitative data that might help explain that. So that's an important piece before teams take action on data, that they're really digging further and understanding, generating a true insight versus just an observation you see on the dashboard.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think going back to like the 5 whys, like why did that happen? Well, why did that happen? Well, why did that? So digging back to those causes. And looks like we've come up on our 7 p.m. mark, and I always, anyone who knows me knows that I try to stay as close to time as possible. So I do want to say thank you very much to both Andy and Michael for giving, not just the time tonight, but also the time in the prep to do this. I learned a lot. I'm definitely going to take it back to my job, and I'm going to tell your anecdotes as my own. No, I'm just kidding. I'll give you credit. But on a similar note for data, we will be trying to reach out to you and get a survey from you. And Jessica, I think she was nudging me to say the survey. So please give us data. We'd love to hear from you. So for everybody who's first-time members, thank you all for joining tonight. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We'd love to see more of you. So, all right. And with that, thank you all.
Thank you.